One of the principal reasons for Germany's defeat in the First World War was the failure of its military plan, the Schlieffen Plan, devised in 1905. The plan intended to attack France through Belgium, encircle Paris within 6 weeks, allowing it to then focus its forces on the war with Russia in the east. The intention was to avoid a two-front war with France and Russia. However, it was critical that the plan took place under time pressure and was performed within 6 weeks. Any delays would cause problems with the mobilizing Russian army in the east. The plan was also based on the assumption that the Russian army was weak, as had been evidenced in the Russian-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905. Furthermore, the expectation was not that Britain would become involved. However, any violation of Belgian neutrality which the plan required could lead to British intervention. So why did the plan fail? Well, firstly, Russia did mobilise faster than expected, and Moltke, the Chief of Staff, had to transfer 2 vital army corps to the Eastern Front. The German army also met stiffer resistance than expected in Belgium, particularly around Liège and Antwerp, and so was delayed. As a result, Paris was not encircled, and at the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, German forces, met by resistance from the British and the French, were forced to retreat. From this point on, we see a stalemate on the Western Front and deadlock, with the resulting trench warfare that the First World War becomes so well known for. From here, Germany are forced to face a two-fronted war for which they had not prepared, neither militarily nor, most importantly, economically. The next major German offensive took place at Verdun in 1916. The intention was to bleed the French army white by committing all their forces. However, thanks to the launching of the Battle of the Somme in November 1916 by the British forces and the Brusilov offensive from Russians in the east, the French troops managed just to hang on, forcing the Germans to transfer their troops to the other fronts. Ultimately, Verdun was indecisive in the short term, with 380,000 French casualties and nearly the same number of German casualties. However, in the long term, the Germans had failed to win a decisive breakthrough, and the war continued. 1916 also turned out to be a decisive year in naval terms. It saw the only real confrontation between the German and British fleet at the Battle of Jutland in the North Sea off the coast of Denmark on the 31st of May and the 1st of June. Indecisive in the short term, the Germans lost 11 ships and 2,500 men, while the British lost 14 ships and 6,000 men. However, in the long term, this was the last time that the German Navy came out to play. It forced them back into the safety of their own harbours, and played into the hands of the British approach to develop a naval blockade on Germany. This therefore led to different strategies being developed by the Germans in 1917, which turned out to be decisive, as we shall see. So with the German Navy confined to port after 1916, the war takes on an increasingly attritional aspect. The British naval blockade begins to bite, weakening Germany's ability to import and export. The population suffer shortages, food, raw materials, the ability to build and develop armaments, all begin to affect Germany's ability to fight the war. As the situation becomes increasingly desperate at home, ultimate measures are taken, and the Germans launch in 1917 their campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, the U-boat campaign, which will do so much to end their chances of winning the war. The unrestricted U-boat campaign began in February 1917. Any hostile ships entering the war zone were to be sunk. The campaign began in the light of the deadlock on the Western Front. There were no alternatives left in sight for the Germans, and the campaign was intended to starve Britain to death and to force her to seek peace. The campaign was effective. British trade was severely damaged. Nearly 500,000 tons of shipping were lost in February and 834,000 in April of 1917. Britain were on the margin of defeat, with supplies running very short. However, the risk taken was that by launching this campaign,
Britain would be defeated before America joined the war. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 had already soured relations between Germany and the US. The U-boat campaign made matters worse. And when the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted in April 1917, a telegram from the Germans encouraging the Mexicans to declare war against America, the die was cast. In April 1917, America joined the war. The British convoy system, adapted to defend the merchant ships by convoys of destroyers, reduced losses to an acceptable level, and Britain were able to continue fighting. Now, the industrial capacity of the USA, alongside the effects of the naval blockade, meant that Germany's defeat was surely now just a question of time. The collapse of the Russians in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution in November offered the Germans one last chance of possible success. However, lengthy negotiations took place before a final treaty was drawn up in March 1918. This 4-month delay meant that Germany could not switch her forces effectively as they might have done towards the Western Front. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 provided Germany with its window of opportunity, a chance for her to shift her eastern armies to the Western Front and to make one last push before the presence of the Americans would make war defeat inevitable. Hindenburg's spring offensive was launched in March 1918. Using mobile units, flamethrowers, it was a forerunner of the blitzkrieg tactics developed so successfully by the Nazis in 1939. Breakthroughs were achieved in the Somme region, in Flanders in April, and the French defensive line was broken at the River Aisne in May. However, with Paris in sight, the Germans were held up at the Second Battle of the Marne in 1918, and from this point on they were pushed back towards the original lines. The Black Day of the German army saw defeat as being something that was now surely imminent. Ultimately, the spring offensive saw Germany advance, but in so doing they lost more men than they could afford to replace. Casualties were high on both sides, with the Allies suffering over 175,000 casualties, but the Germans endured over 235,000. More to the point, this loss of manpower and equipment for the Allies was replaceable because American military and industrial power was now being brought to bear, but the Germans could not and were unable to replace the number lost in terms of men and munitions. The problems faced by the Germans were compounded by the weakness of her main ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There were high levels of desertion. Many troops from different ethnic origins were expected to fight and commit themselves to a cause that they didn't believe in. The Austro-Hungarian forces were fighting with obsolete equipment and technology. Whilst the Turks successfully held off British campaigns in Gallipoli, they came under great pressure in the Middle East, and Bulgaria was only of minor importance to the war as a whole. It is this imbalance of Allied forces which ultimately helps us understand Germany's eventual defeat. Whilst Britain, France, now after 1917 America, had the resources of great industrial power at their disposal, Germany was allied with weakening powers and could no longer withhold and withstand the pressure she was forced to face. Under such pressure, not only was it the military system that was unable to cope, but neither was the political and economic system back at home. At the outset of the war, German support had largely bridged virtually all political viewpoints, but by May 1916 there were signs of dissent emerging, particularly within the SPD, with demonstrations taking place against the war, strikes amongst workers. Economically, the demands of war were also beginning to bite. By 1916 there were food shortages and riots occurring, and 1917 became known as the Turnip Winter in recognition of the food shortages that were biting the German public. Germany's reliance on imports were affected by the Allied blockade, which saw German scientists increasingly under pressure to produce synthetic versions of gunpowder and rubber. These economic and political pressures were building inside Germany, but the political collapse was triggered by events involving a naval mutiny in Kiel. Ordered to take to the sea on the 30th of October and engage the British fleet, the German sailors refused. The mutiny spread as workers' and soldiers' councils sprang up across Germany, demanding political reform and an end to the war. Revolt broke out all over Germany, and faced with such pressure, the Kaiser was forced to abdicate. The civilian government which replaced him approached the Allies for peace, and the war ended on the 11th of November 1918 with an armistice. So, to recap, military failures in 1914 and the absence of any real alternative strategies committed Germany to fighting precisely the kind of war that they'd hoped to avoid. The German economy was ultimately unable to cope with the pressures of war, accentuated by the effective Allied blockade. Attempts to win the war grew increasingly desperate, culminating in the launching of an unrestricted U-boat campaign in 1917. Whilst the collapse of Russia and the early successes of the spring offensive in 1918 suggest that Germany could have won the war, the intervention of the USA with its huge economic potential was vital. This is particularly so when contrasted with the weakness of Germany's principal allies. As the spring offensive withered, so the social, political and economic strains began to increasingly reveal themselves inside Germany, leading to the eventual collapse of the Wilhelmine Empire and military defeat in November 1918.